Okay, so Luke chapter 22, we're going to pick up in verse 39. If you remember, Jesus, they just had the Last Supper, the Lord's Supper, the Passover meal, and now Jesus is going out with his disciples to the Mount of Olives, and they're going to pray, and Jesus will be arrested, and that's where we're at now. So verse 39, Jesus went out as usual to the Mount of Olives, and his disciples followed him. On reaching the place, he said to them, "Pray that you will not fall into temptation." He withdrew about a stone's throw beyond them, knelt down and prayed, "Father, if you are willing, take this cup from me, yet not my will, but yours be done." An angel from heaven appeared to him and strengthened him, and being in anguish, he prayed more earnestly, and his sweat was like drops of blood falling to the ground. When he rose from prayer and went back to the disciples, he found them asleep, exhausted from sorrow. "Why are you sleeping?" he asked them. "Get up and pray so that you will not fall into temptation." While he was still speaking, a crowd came up, and the man who was called Judas, one of the 12, was leading them. He approached Judas to kiss him, but Jesus asked him, "Judas, are you betraying the Son of Man with a kiss?" When Jesus' followers saw what was going to happen, they said, "Lord, should we strike with our swords?" One of them struck the servant of the high priest, cutting off his right ear. But Jesus answered, "No more of this." And he touched the man's ear and healed him. Then Jesus said to the chief priests, the officers of the temple guard, and the elders who had come for him, "Am I leading a rebellion that you have come with swords and clubs? Every day I was with you in the temple courts, and you did not lay a hand on me. But this is your hour when darkness reigns." So, I have combined here what is in my Bible anyway, two separate sections in order to talk about everything that happened on the Mount of Olives all at once. That whole narrative all at once. So, I have jokingly, I think when we started this series, I called Luke's Gospel the extended edition of the Gospel. It's the director's cut of the New Testament. And that is true. There's a lot of stuff in Luke that you don't find anywhere else, especially, all the very early stuff about Jesus' life. But there's several things noticeably absent from Luke's account of everything that goes down on the Mount of Olives. So I pointed the first one out last week in Matthew chapter 26, verse 40, when Jesus finds Peter, James, John asleep, he says, "Couldn't you men keep watch with me for 1 hour?" He asked Peter, "Watch and pray so that you will not fall into temptation. The spirit is willing, but the flesh is weak." Now, that same chapter with Matthew also includes this, which isn't in Luke. After the unnamed, and we'll get to that in a minute, disciple cuts off one of the ears of the unnamed, again, we'll get to that, servant of the high priest, Matthew says this, "Put your sword back in its place, for all who draw the sword will die by the sword. Do you think I cannot call on my Father, and he will at once put at my disposal more than 12 legions of angels? But how then would the scriptures be fulfilled that say it must happen in this way?" So both of those are found in Matthew's account. You don't find them in Luke. If you watch a movie, right, like The Passion of the Christ or something, it's probably going to include this. And so you kind of grow up, I'm assuming we all grew up Christian probably, and you sort of expect that as part of what goes down, and then it's absent from Luke. And of course, Luke has a big emphasis on answering the question, who is Jesus really? And a lot of that plays into this, why he includes certain things and doesn't. John's account also includes a couple things that aren't found in Luke or anywhere else, as far as I know. John's account actually tells us the name of the servant of the high priest, and it is Malchus. So Malchus has his ear chopped off by, John tells us, Peter. So Peter's the one who draws the sword to cut off the servant Malchus's ear. That's all from John. Now, why is this important? Peter was already warned about his future denial, right? 3 times you will deny me, the rooster will crow, all of that, right? And as well, Peter was already warned that Satan has asked to sift all of you as wheat. And then Jesus specifically talks about praying for Peter, right? Now we see only, hours later, presumably, that Peter has fallen asleep on the job. And then when he's awoken, he immediately resorts to violence in an attempt to prevent Jesus from being captured. So even now, even at the very end of Jesus' life, Peter still doesn't understand, right? Because Satan would want more than anything for Peter to get in the way of Jesus' crucifixion, right? Satan would want more than anything to prevent the crucifixion from happening. And part of that sifting from Satan is this vengeance that Peter wants against Judas and the temple guard and the servant of the high priest and the Roman soldiers who were accompanying all of them, right? Part of this sifting is playing into this vengeance that Peter has, this misunderstanding that Peter has, especially, verse 38, or 30, 38, the disciples are gathering swords. They say, look, Lord, we already have 2 swords. Is this enough? In Matthew chapter 16, take a look at what Jesus says. He says, from that time on, Jesus began to explain to his disciples that he must go to Jerusalem and suffer many things at the hands of the elders, the chief priests, and the teachers of the law, and that he must be killed and on the 3rd day raised to life. Now, this is the interesting part. Peter took him aside and began to rebuke him. So Peter's rebuking Jesus here. Never, Lord, Peter said, this shall never happen to you. And then Jesus turned to Peter and said, get behind me, Satan. You are a stumbling block to me. You do not have in mind the concerns of God, but merely human concerns. So this is your first blank. In other words, to stand in the way or to attempt to prevent Jesus' death is actually to align oneself with what Satan wants. To stand in the way or to prevent Jesus' death is actually to align oneself with what Satan wants. Now, this doesn't mean, like when we think of Satan worship today, we think of, I spray painted a pentagram in my bedroom and, I'm, sacrificing goats. I don't mean it in that way. I don't mean that Peter was worshiping Satan. But unbeknownst to him, he is, being sifted, right? That's the terminology that's used by Satan, right? Why? Because he was asleep. He was not paying attention. And this actually brings up a little bit of an interesting discussion. And maybe this is a little bit of a rabbit to chase. But your next blank, in some ways, it would make sense that Satan would want to prevent the crucifixion. It would make sense that Satan would want to prevent it. After all, the crucifixion gave way to the resurrection, which, I preached a whole Easter Sunday sermon about that not too long ago. And I listed a couple things. I'll rattle them off very quick. These are all attributed to the resurrection. The forgiveness of sins and our justification. Romans chapter 4, verse 25. New birth in our living hope. 1 Peter chapter 1, verse 3. The defeat of sin and the defeat of death. Romans chapter 6, verses 8 through 11. The restoration of paradise. Revelation 21, 1 through 5 and 22, 1 through 5. And Hebrews chapter 2, verse 14 attributes the defeat or the breaking of power, breaking the power, of Satan through the crucifixion. It doesn't specifically mention the resurrection, but considering everything else I just pointed out, as well as common sense, right? Had the resurrection not happened, then Jesus would have been a liar, so you kind of have to have one along with the other. I think it's safe to say that, implied by the writer of Hebrews is that the resurrection is, also attributed to breaking the power of Satan, the defeat of Satan. So, in one sense, in one way, it makes sense that Satan would want to prevent the resurrection because, or the crucifixion, because the crucifixion gave way to the resurrection, which gave way to Satan's defeat, right? However, your next blank, you probably guessed it, it also makes sense that Satan would not want to prevent the crucifixion. How much does Satan really know, right? He clearly seems to know that the crucifixion is part of the divine plan, because why else would he tempt Jesus with an easy way out in chapter 4? You don't have to suffer, you don't have to die, just bow down and worship me and I'll give you some authority, right? But you'll notice Satan influences Judas to betray Jesus, which leads to his arrest and crucifixion, which then gives rise to the resurrection and Satan's defeat. So if Satan understood fully what the divine plan was and that would mean his defeat, why would Satan do something that sort of led to that by influencing Judas to betray Jesus? So, maybe Satan thought that he could be the one to control the way things played out and, keep Jesus in the ground, keep Jesus buried. Obviously, it didn't work out that way. But, in one sense, Satan, does seem, do things to prevent the crucifixion from happening. In other ways, he does things to encourage the crucifixion and speed that process along. And, it's not that Satan has schizophrenia. It's just that, he's not exactly omniscient in the same way that God is. But to get back to Peter's actions here, all right, sleeping on the job, slicing off the ear of Malchus, much like I talked about last week, Peter was not prepared in the midst of the greatest spiritual struggle of his life. Your next blank. He took the call to arms literally, right? Peter took the call to arms literally, and he made sure he had a sword with him and was ready to strike. But he couldn't even stay awake to pray so that he wouldn't fall into temptation. Verse 46. Get up and pray so that you will not fall into temptation. By not preparing spiritually, Peter ended up unknowingly doing exactly what Satan wanted him to do. He was sifted successfully by Satan. Your next blank. It all could have been avoided had he been preparing spiritually through prayer. It all could have been avoided had he been preparing spiritually through prayer. And that's sort of the sad part about it. I mean, obviously hindsight is 20/20. It's very easy for us to look at Peter and say, "Hey, you big dummy." But I mean, that's the sad reality is, you look at there's sort of a chain of events, right? And you get to Peter 3 times denying Jesus, and you think, wow, that's really bad. But then you back up a little bit, and even in the garden, he's misunderstanding the nature of Jesus and his purpose in coming to earth, which is ultimately to die. And Jesus has made that clear multiple times throughout Luke. Peter still doesn't get it, and he wants to take up arms and fight. And you think, man, that's pretty bad. How did it get like that? And then you back up even further, and you see Peter asleep. And you're like, man, you big dummy, wake up. How did he get this bad? And then you back up and you realize, I mean, all the way when they were still back in the upper room celebrating the Passover, Jesus warned him, said, hey, you're going to deny me. And Satan has asked to sift you like wheat. And Peter, nah, I'll die for you if I have to, right? Very prideful almost. And he was doing all of the physical preparations, but none of the spiritual preparations. And that was ultimately his downfall. So to quickly summarize, Peter was being used by Satan here. Again, that doesn't mean he was worshiping Satan. That's not what I'm saying. He was aligning himself with what Satan wanted. And again, perhaps Satan thought that if he could truly sift Peter and the other disciples, that he could turn the crucifixion from his own defeat into his own victory. Satan has taken a backseat role in the Gospel of Luke until this opportune time, which we talked about last week, right? After the temptation narrative, it says Satan departed until an opportune time. Well, that opportune time is now. And Jesus even says, right, this is your hour when darkness reigns. Showing that Peter, the temple guard, the Roman soldiers, all these people were all being used, again, unknowingly, very likely, they were all being used by Satan, right? Satan understood this opportune time, right? When darkness reigns. And it wasn't just that, Satan influenced Judas. He influenced Peter. He influenced the Roman guard. He influenced the temple guard. He influenced the Jewish leaders, the elders and chief priests and all of this, all of these people, right? This is a quote that I thought was really good. It says, what was taking place involved a far deeper opposition than that between the Jewish leadership and Jesus. It involved the cosmic opposition between Satan, the ruler of this age, and God, right? And again, Peter didn't understand that. He was thinking way too physically, right? Had he sort of zoned out and looked at the big picture of All of redemptive history has been leading up to this moment. Jesus himself has talked about and prophesied about this moment. We're not fighting against Rome. We're not fighting against the synagogue or the temple. We're fighting against Satan, and Satan is the one sifting them, right? The only other thing from this section that I'll point out and talk about is, if you have a Bible that has footnotes, you'll probably see something that verses 43 and 44 are most likely not original to Luke. And basically, right, especially if you're using like the King James or the New King James, obviously the King James is like 500 years old, 600 or 400 years old, something very, very old. And, archaeology had not progressed. So, at the time, what was like the oldest manuscript that we had for the Old and New Testament, over the last 400 years or whatever, we have discovered way older dating manuscripts. And so the oldest manuscripts that we have, and also the best manuscript tradition, if you don't know what that is, don't worry about it, it doesn't really matter, do not include verses 43 and 44. Now, that doesn't mean that it's like unbiblical, but these were likely added later. Different scribes took this, and obviously they didn't have printers, so they would have to copy it by hand. And a lot of times what ended up happening is, you have obviously the written tradition as well as the oral tradition, and parts of the oral tradition would get mixed in with the written tradition. That's all that really means. And what I find interesting about these verses is there's a song, and it's one of those where like you look it up at the hymnal and it's just the first verse is like the title of the song. I don't actually know what the title is, but it's that I stand amazed in the presence of Jesus of Galilee, or whatever. The Nazarene, I don't know. He was from Galilee, so that wasn't theologically inaccurate, even if it was musically inaccurate. In any case, one of the verses says, "For me it was in the garden, he prayed, not my will but thine. He had no tears for his own grief, but sweat drops of blood for mine." Now, I'm not like the nitpicky guy, so I'm not saying like, don't ever sing the song, it's like heretical. Like, I don't really care. I don't, that's not what I'm saying. But I do find it interesting. I don't really think that that's the best theology in the world. Obviously, it's fine. Most people singing it, aren't really thinking about the theology of it, which I guess is another problem. But it almost makes it seem as if Jesus is just some sort of superhero who felt no pain at all, experienced no real human emotions on his own behalf. The only emotion that Jesus felt was, for my behalf, right? That's just not really true, not just here, but the New Testament as a whole, right? You see Jesus weeping for Lazarus. You're not told he wept on Mary or Martha's behalf. And the people even say, when they see Jesus weeping, they're like, oh, he's weeping because he loved Lazarus, right? Jesus was fully God, yes, but he was also fully human. He was 100% human. And part of that is experiencing human emotions, right? Jesus got angry, and that's something that I think people don't think about. Now, he never used that anger unbiblically. There's a biblical way to experience the whole spectrum of emotions. But yeah, Jesus was completely human. So, he obviously felt pain. So when he was, experienced quite possibly the worst way to die in human history, yeah, it hurt. He didn't just, it wasn't just some sort of superhero or something. Yeah, he felt pain. And
when it talks there about him, when he prayed, that he sweat great drops of blood, you can actually do that. Your body can.
Right.
So when you're very stressed, like people that are really sick or very bad or in pain, like that have cancer and different things, because that happened to one of my cousins as he was dying. And I had asked my brother, who's a doctor, about it, and he said, yes, it happens when their body is in such stress.
Right.
So Jesus was so stressed,
right,
about what he was fixing to do and taking on the weight of all of our sin.
Right, exactly. It's,
But I didn't really know that for a long time, and you wonder, well, I'm gonna do that, but,
International says like.
yeah, but,
Right. Yeah, I think it actually cheapens the sacrifice a little bit if Jesus didn't experience any stress or any pain while doing it. But in any case, just as Jesus asked James and John, and I got into this a little bit last week, can you drink the cup that I drink, right? James and John come to Jesus. They say, hey, one of us sit on your right, one of us sit on your left. Jesus asked them, can you drink the cup that I drink? And of course the answer, yeah, we can. No, they can't. They didn't understand what they were saying. Just as Jesus asked James and John that question, Jesus now says to the Father, if you are willing, take this cup from me. Yet not my will, but yours be done. Right? And again, Jesus was not, sort of triumphantly carrying his cross with a big smile on his face, right? Jesus was beaten, he was spit on, he was mocked, he had a crown of thorns pushed down into his skull. He was forced to carry a cross, which is incredibly heavy, after he had been beaten and all this other stuff had happened. And then he was ultimately nailed to the cross, and all of the, you either can't breathe or you can, but you have excruciating pain in your hands and feet. Everything that goes along with that. To the extent that Jesus sweated and wept and all of this, he did it because he knew it would be painful, right? And that's not to say that, Jesus didn't at all think about, our behalf or humanity's behalf. But I think to say, he had no tears at all for his own grief, I think that again cheapens it a little bit. The difference ultimately between Jesus and his disciples, this is your next blank, is that Jesus could drink the cup of suffering. And that's really what the difference is, right? Yes, James and John, can you drink the cup I'm going to drink? They say, oh, of course we can, right? Jesus tells Peter, hey, you're going to deny me 3 times. Peter says, oh, I won't deny you. I'll die for you if I have to, right? We see how that worked out. None of his disciples could drink the cup of suffering. Only Jesus could drink the cup of suffering, and that's the difference. And
Didn't they later? I mean, most of them died from being.
Well, yeah, I mean, eventually, right? Like Peter, church tradition says he was crucified upside down. Whether or not that happens, I don't know, but it's a cool story, so I like to think it did. But yeah, I mean, eventually, and Peter in John's gospel, they call it the restoration of Peter. That's where Jesus 3 times asked Peter, do you love me? And then Peter sort of restored and, given a task. But, during Jesus's, final moments before his crucifixion, all of his disciples left except for John. But
I think I'm getting off here, but the fact that Jesus knew exactly what was going to happen to him when he was in the garden, he knew exactly what was going to happen, and even when he was teaching and all.
right.
And I think that would make a difference in how that affected you, how you'd be afraid, I think, be in anguish.
Right. Well, yeah, I mean, even before Jesus was born as a human, that was always the plan. So,
when you're up there, it's fine.
right, for however many thousands of years, from creation. I mean, Jesus is eternal. So I'm not saying that God did not exist before creation, but to simplify the language, however many thousands of years from creation until, Jesus was born, you're just kind of counting down the days until, okay, one of these days I'm going to have to be bored. And, like we talked about week 1, Jesus was poor, right? He did not necessarily grow up wealthy and affluent. So, nothing about Jesus' life was easy. And again, I think that makes it, how much greater a Savior is one who knows his suffering in advance and yet does the will of the Father anyway. So, anyway, but we do need to get going or else we will be here all night. So, Luke 22, verses 54 through 65. Then seizing him, they led him away and took him into the house of the high priest. Peter followed at a distance, and when some there had kindled a fire in the middle of the courtyard and had sat down together, Peter sat down with them. A servant girl saw him seated there in the firelight. She looked closely at him and said, "This man was with him." But he denied it. "Woman, I don't know him," he said. A little later, someone else saw him and said, "You are one of them." "Man, I am not," Peter replied. About an hour later, another asserted, "Certainly this fellow was with him, for he is a Galilean." Peter replied, "Man, I don't know what you're talking about." Just as he was speaking, the rooster crowed. The Lord turned and looked straight at Peter. Then Peter remembered the word the Lord had spoken to him, "Before the rooster crows today, you will disown me 3 times." And he went outside and wept bitterly. And then a very short section. The men who were guarding Jesus began mocking and beating him. They blindfolded him and demanded, "Prophesy, who hit you?" And they said many other insulting things to him. So, Luke's account, we don't have any other mention of, any of the other disciples, right? We have mention of Peter, but no one else. Mark gives us the detail of what happened to them. Mark chapter 14, verse 50 says, after Jesus was arrested, everyone deserted him and fled. There's even a weird bit where somebody is trying to run and, I probably could flip there. I don't necessarily remember off the top of my head, but somehow his robe comes off and he ends up just running away naked. And it's just one of those, it's just kind of thrown in there. And, my mind can't help but think that, does that really contribute to the overall plot of Mark? Probably not, but I think Mark just put that in there for fun, right? Just as a funny aside. But Mark tells us that everyone else deserted Jesus and fled. And so Peter also deserted Jesus, but he ran away so he wouldn't be arrested too. But he didn't go far. He's following from a distance and watching everything go down. And it says, Peter follows at a distance as Jesus is taken to, John fills us in on this one, the house of Annas, right? Whereas here it just says the house of the high priest. Now, as a little bit of a refresher, when we talked all the way back in chapter 3, we talked about Annas and Caiaphas. And this is what we said. Annas was given the title high priest around AD 6 or 7. The date isn't necessarily important. By AD 15, he was removed from the office of high priest, but he kept the title. Okay, so I think I compared it to the presidency, right? Oftentimes you will still call a former president so-and-so. Sometimes they'll say former president so-and-so, but, in just casual conversation, you'll say, oh, well, President Bush did this. President Obama did that, right? Same thing with the high priest. Even though he had that title removed, Annas did. He still held the title. There was a chain of people that followed after Annas as high priest. By the time of John the Baptist's ministry, which we picked up in chapter 3, and also Jesus' ministry, Caiaphas was the acting high priest who was the son-in-law of Annas. All right. So Annas was a high priest for a while. He retired or was kicked out, whatever. He kept the title. There were several other people, a quick succession that followed. Eventually, by the time of Jesus' ministry, Caiaphas is the acting high priest. So he has the title and the responsibility, and he's also the son-in-law of this guy, Annas. All right, and this is your first blank of this section, and this is the exact same blank from when we covered chapter 3. So it says, it was to Annas first, Annas. It was to Annas first, and then Caiaphas, Caiaphas. It was to Annas first, and then Caiaphas that Jesus was sent to be questioned. And we know that from John's account where it says that Annas sent him to Caiaphas. So, even though Annas was not the acting high priest, he, somehow managed to be a part of this proceeding. As for Peter's denial, I've already kind of talked about most of it last week, and even a little bit this week already in the last section, in terms of, well, how did he get himself into this situation? What led to this point, right? I will add that we can see the difference between Peter's denial and Judas's betrayal. So Matthew's account, Matthew 27, verses 3 through 5, say, when Judas, who had betrayed Jesus, saw that he was condemned, he was seized with remorse and returned the 30 pieces of silver to the chief priest and the elders. I have sinned, he said, for I have betrayed innocent blood. What is that to us? They replied. That's your responsibility. So Judas threw the money into the temple and left. Then he went away and hanged himself. So that's Judas. On the other hand, we're told here in Luke, verse 62, which we read, that Peter went outside and wept bitterly. So Judas, was remorseful and gave the money back, but then he killed himself. Peter, on the other hand, Luke tells us, went outside and wept bitterly. And then John's gospel fills in more of the blanks. After Jesus' resurrection and before his ascension, we have, again, the restoration of Peter. So this is John chapter 21, verses 18 through 19. This is right after Jesus asked Peter 3 times, do you love me? Jesus says to Peter, very truly I tell you, when you were younger, you dressed yourself and went where you wanted. But when you are old, you will stretch out your hands and someone else will dress you and lead you where you do not want to go. And then John explains exactly what this means. Jesus said this to indicate the kind of death by which Peter would glorify God. Then Jesus said to him, follow me, right? Very similar to what Jesus said the first time around he told him, right? So this is your second and last blank for this. Both men, Judas and Peter, were sad. Peter wept and Judas was remorseful, but only Peter came back to follow Jesus anew or fresh or again, or however you want to phrase that, right? Only Peter came back to follow Jesus anew. And that's what true repentance is, right? Being sad or remorseful, like it says that Judas is, that's not the totality of repentance. Judas was sad, but he never changed. He never made an effort to change, never wanted to change. He just killed himself. Peter was sad, and then where is he? Resurrection, he's there. The times Jesus appears to his disciples, he's there. And he reaffirms, I love you, I love you, I love you. And then Jesus says, okay, now you go where you want to go. You do all the things for yourself. One of these days, you're going to go where you don't want to go. You're going to have other people dress you and carry you around. You're going to die for me, basically. And then Jesus once again says, follow me, right? That's true repentance. So, continuing, verses 66 through 71. This will end chapter 22. At daybreak, the council of the elders of the people, both the chief priests and the teachers of the law, met together, and Jesus was led before them. If you are the Messiah, they said, tell us. Jesus answered, if I tell you, you will not believe me. And if I asked you, you will not answer. But from now on, the Son of Man will be seated at the right hand of the mighty God. They all asked, are you the Son of God? He replied, you say that I am. Then they said, why do we need any more testimony? We've heard it from his own lips. So, this would be the part where you would want this sheet of paper, which everyone should have gotten a copy of. And this is taken from Robert Stein's New American Commentary on Luke. This is a resource which I have been using throughout our study in Luke. It's not the only commentary I use, but it's one of the main ones. And, I'm not going to read every single thing on this page. Take this home. Did you just say good? Jeez.
It's already 10 after.
Yeah, but we start at 30, so I still have 20 minutes, so we're fine. I'm not going to go through everything on this. Take it home, read through it if you want, throw it away if you want. No, you're not going to offend me. Next time you're going through Luke or any of the four Gospels and you're curious as to why some have some things, some have another, you can look at this. But there are basically three separate chronologies of Jesus being put on trial. So you have Luke, you have John, and then you have Matthew and Mark. So Matthew and Mark follow each other pretty much the same. John is a little bit different, and Luke is a little bit different. And then, that fourth section, the most common attempt to reconstruct these events is as follows. And this is the part we'll actually go through. Jesus is arrested. All four Gospels have that. So the Arabic numeral 1, the Roman numeral 1, and the A, right? That's basically Mark and Matthew include it, John includes it, and Luke includes it. So all four Gospels have Jesus is arrested. Only John specifically names Annas by name as Jesus appearing before Annas. So that would be second. But then John tells us that Annas gave Jesus to Caiaphas. So again, all four Gospels have Jesus is tried by the Sanhedrin, which is led by Caiaphas. Then only Matthew and Mark have the Sanhedrin meeting a second time to draw up charges against Jesus to be presented before Pilate. And then all four have Jesus being led to Pilate. So, you can see kind of the differences. Some have more, some have less, some choose to include some things to have a specific theological focus, some choose to exclude certain things for a certain focus. You get the idea, right? I'm not going to go into this too much, but Luke is all about who is Jesus really, right? Answering this question, who do you say that I am? And so, why things are arranged the way they are with Jesus before Pilate and Herod and Luke, it's primarily to serve that purpose, right? Because as much as these are works of history, like you'd read a history textbook, they're also sort of making an argument for, yes, Jesus is the Messiah, yes, Jesus is the Son of God. So in order to make that argument flow, certain things are left out. But in any case, let's talk about the Sanhedrin. We also talked about the Sanhedrin way back in chapter 3. A lot of chapter 3 is coming back to us tonight. This is your first blank. The Sanhedrin is specifically a Jewish court of law. Specifically a Jewish court of law. And this makes sense given the charges that Jesus is brought up on. Blasphemy, right? Your next blank, it would be Rome, however, that actually carried out the penalty, right? Jesus is brought up in the Sanhedrin, the Jewish court on blasphemy laws. Obviously, Jews are going to be the ones concerned about blaspheming Yahweh, the Jewish God. Rome's not going to care about that. But Sanhedrin didn't actually have the authority to put Jesus to death. So it was the Roman, not court, but it was the Roman officials that actually carried out the penalty. This is a quote. It says, "The Sanhedrin is the highest ruling body and court of justice among the Jewish people in the time of Jesus. Headed by the high priest of Israel, the Sanhedrin was granted limited authority over certain religious, civil, and criminal matters by the foreign nations that dominated the land of Israel at various times in its history." What does that mean? Basically, we're going to conquer you, and don't make no mistake about it, you are conquered. We are your conquerors. But we're nice guys. And also, we don't want to deal with all of your petty religious disputes. So we will let you have your own court system. And the day-to-day, priest so-and-so said something at synagogue meeting last week, and, that's a violation of, Leviticus, and, we want to bring a charge against priest so-and-so, right? Rome does not have the time or the patience to deal with that. So they said, okay, we're going to give you your own court system. You can deal with that. But it's a limited authority, right? You don't have total authority to just do whatever you want to. Right? That's what the Sanhedrin is. At first, the Sanhedrin inquires. I can't read my own. I didn't even write this. This is typed. They inquire. They ask, basically. They don't necessarily put in the form of a question. But they're trying to figure out, is Jesus the Messiah? Right? Verse 67, if you are the Messiah, the Sanhedrin said, tell us. Then they asked Jesus if he is the Son of God. Right? Verse 70, they all asked, are you then the Son of God? And in both instances, Jesus appears, that's your key word there, appears to be dodging the question. Jesus calls himself the Son of Man, but not the Son of God, and not the Messiah, right? This is your next blank. The Jews clearly understood that Jesus was asserting himself to be both the Son of God and the Messiah, right? And I actually added that onto your blank, so good on me for doing that, I guess. He clearly asserted himself to be both Son of God and Messiah, right? Verse 71, why do we need any more testimony? We have heard it from his own lips, right? The Jews understood that Jesus isn't dodging the question, right? What Jesus said was enough to, if Jesus was actually blaspheming, right? If Jesus was not the Son of God, if Jesus was not the Messiah, the Jews understood that what Jesus was saying was enough for him to be convicted of blasphemy, right? Because they understood that Jesus is affirming, I am, right? I am the Son of God. John chapter 8, verses 58 through 59. Jesus says this, very truly I tell you, before Abraham was born, I am. Very famous, right? Probably heard a sermon or two about that. What is the crowd's response to this? At this, they picked up stones to stone him, but Jesus hid himself, slipping away from the temple grounds. Now, this is important because especially Muslims, and you get it with Jews as well, although, Jews often don't care necessarily whether Jesus claimed to be the Son of God. They just say he wasn't the Son of God. But you see this a lot with Muslims for some reason, where they say, well, Jesus never once claimed to be the Son of God. Yes, you might not necessarily verbatim, word for word, Jesus say, I am the Son of God. And that's like exactly how it's those exact words in that exact order. But make no mistake about it, right? Multiple times, the things that Jesus said, right? Today, this prophecy has been fulfilled in your hearing, right? We talked about that in Luke chapter 4 or whatever it is, right? The people understood who Jesus was claiming to be, right? Before Abraham was, I am Yahweh, the divine name of God, right? The Jews understood this, right? It might be lost on us because of translation. Jewish leaders understood that Jesus was claiming, your next blank, right? Make no mistake about it. Throughout Jesus' time on earth, he asserted himself to be the Messiah and equal with the Father in nature and essence. I said this when we covered the baptism of Jesus, but essence is basically the whatness, right? What makes you, you. But in any case, your next blank. Jesus' assertions are affirmed by the other members of the Trinity. And then in parentheses, put Jesus' baptism. So if you remember at Jesus' baptism, right, you have the other two members of the Trinity, the Father and the Spirit, affirming Jesus is the Son of God. You have the Holy Spirit coming down in the form of a dove and landing on Jesus, and then you have the voice of the Father saying, this is my Son in whom I am well pleased. So Jesus isn't just saying this with no proof, so to speak. The other two members of the Trinity are affirming what Jesus is saying about himself. And again, your next blank, the Jews repeatedly understand Jesus' assertions, and this is exactly why they are charging him with blasphemy. Jesus basically says there's no point in answering the question if he is the Messiah, since they would not believe him anyway, right? As for the second question, are you the Son of God? Jesus' answer, this is a quote, it says, his answer has been variously taken as meaning, you have a couple translation options here. Basically different ways to translate this. The words are yours, but I admit the identification. Does that make sense? You said it, but I identify with what you're saying as that is true. That's one option. Second option, the words are yours, and I make no comment. Basically. Third option, I am what you say that I am. And lastly, in the form of a question, do you say or are you saying that I am the Son of God? And again, I took way more Greek than I ever cared to in my life. But I am not nearly, you have the left brain and the right brain, and one's creative and one's math and stuff and all of that. Whatever side of the brain that is, I don't have enough of it to explain exactly what about the Greek makes it confusing for this specific verse. But this is one of those verses where people who've studied Greek their whole life scratch their heads and go, how exactly should this be translated? But there is no mistake that no matter how you translate it, Jesus is affirming the actual, accusation. If the accusation is, you claim to be the Son of God, Jesus is affirming that, even if he might be distancing himself from, well, you're the one who said it, right? If that makes sense. So, Jesus is concerned with the inward belief, or I guess the lack thereof, from the Sanhedrin, as well as their unjust methods conducted during this trial. All right? The Sanhedrin would not even entertain a positive answer to the question, are you the Son of God? As, they would not even entertain the possibility that Jesus answering, yes, I am the Son of God, could be true, right? The same question Jesus asked his disciples in chapter 9, verse 20, who do you say I am, right? The Sanhedrin are now asking Jesus, right? Well, basically, who do you say that you are? Do you say you're the Son of God? And Jesus says, well, you said it, or I don't know, you tell me, right? Who do you say I am, right? How could the Sanhedrin be judging Jesus fairly if they would not even consider the truthfulness of Jesus' claims? If Jesus is claiming to be the Son of God, and the Sanhedrin already off the bat, before they even ask the question, have it made up in their mind, we know for a fact he's not the Son of God, how can this be a fair trial? How can they be judging Jesus fairly, right? They seek to crucify Jesus on his claim alone. They seek to kill Jesus on the fact that he claimed to be the Son of God, not as to whether or not he actually was, because they just assumed, well, obviously he's not the Son of God, right? Okay, we have like 6 minutes. Let's go. We can do this. 23, verses 1 through 7. Then the whole assembly rose and led him off to Pilate, and they began to accuse him, saying, we have found this man subverting our nation. He opposes payment of taxes to Caesar and claims to be Messiah, a king. So Pilate asked Jesus, are you the king of the Jews? You have said so, Jesus replied. Then Pilate announced to the chief priests and the crowd, I find no basis for a charge against this man. But they insisted, he stirs up the people all over Judea by his teaching. He started in Galilee and has come all the way here. On hearing this, Pilate asked if the man was a Galilean. When he heard that Jesus was under Herod's jurisdiction, he sent him to Herod, who was also in Jerusalem at that time. Now, this is a weird place for me to be breaking, but one, I did it because I knew this would be about an hour. And two, we're kind of cutting the trial in half because there are two questionings which we will cover. The one before Ananias and Caiaphas, right, the Sanhedrin trial, and then his first instance before Pilate. We're going to cover those two. And then next week, there'll be another 2 with Jesus before Herod, and then Jesus' second appearance before Pilate, where he's eventually sentenced to be crucified. So it is kind of a weird place to break, but just think of it that way. You just split it in half. If you'll notice, Ananias and Caiaphas and the Sanhedrin, those 2 things we talked about in chapter 3. Well, we also talked about Pilate in chapter 3. Everything from chapter 3 is coming back, right? And this is what we said in regards to Pilate. Pontius Pilate was the prefect or governor over Judea from 26 AD until 36 AD. So the entirety of Jesus's earthly ministry, right? And then we also said that after a certain time, 53 AD, the term was no longer prefect, but was procurator. So, like by the time of Acts, with like Festus and stuff, they would be known as the procurator. But that's not necessarily relevant for this. So we have, again, the chief priests, Ananias and Caiaphas, we talked about in chapter 3. We have the Sanhedrin, we talked about in chapter 3. We have Pilate, we talked about in chapter 3. So all of this stuff, and even chapter 4, we talked about Satan, right? And then now he's reappeared. So all of these things, Luke is a very good writer, right? All of these things were kind of set up very early on in the book. These are the main players. That doesn't necessarily mean they're going to be in every single chapter. They're not, not every single thing that Jesus does they're going to be a part of, but these are your main players, right? Jesus, the disciples, you have the Jewish section with the high priest and the Sanhedrin, you have the Roman section with Pilate, and these are your main players, and it's all going to culminate at the end of the book in one final showdown, basically, right? Except unlike a good, fiction book or a movie, this is real. This happened, right? And so I think that this all goes into, that opportune time for Satan, right? Well, obviously the opportune time is now when all of these figures are converging at the end. But I need to get going. So the Sanhedrin could not condemn Jesus to death on their own. We talked about that. They could bring their case before Roman officials, and that's what they do. And if you'll notice, the way in which they bring Jesus before Pilate, they don't say, we found this man blaspheming our God. We found this man blaspheming Yahweh, right? How exactly do they put it? We have found this man subverting our nation. He opposes payment of taxes to Caesar and claims to be Messiah, a king, right? Notice the language here. Claims of messiahship would likely be of very little interest to Rome unless it also involved claims to be a king. Because Judea was a conquered land. The Jews were a conquered people, and they only had one king in the eyes of Rome, and that is Caesar, right? So, and Rome wanted to keep it that way. So your next blank, couple the threat of a man subverting Roman authority by claiming to be king. Yes, there's a back. Yes. You just thought we were done.
Claiming to be king.
To be king. Couple the threat of a man subverting Roman authority by claiming to be king with an opposition to paying taxes to Rome. Couple those two things together, claiming to be king and opposing taxes, and you can see that the Sanhedrin knew exactly what they were doing to get Pilate to take their case seriously, right? If we want Pilate to take our case seriously, we're not going to say, this man is blaspheming our Jewish God. They're going to say, this man wants to be king. This man wants to overthrow Caesar. This man says we shouldn't pay taxes. Taxes to who? To Rome. Right? That's how you get Pilate to take your case seriously. Now, obviously, Jesus wasn't opposed to taxes. We talked about that in chapter 20. And we've also talked about Jesus' kingdom and his claims to be king are spiritual in nature. But that doesn't matter for the Sanhedrin and the Jewish leaders that just want him out of the picture. So, speeding things up. Again, Jesus seemingly dodges questions. Pilate asked, "Are you the king of the Jews?" And again, you have a little bit of how do you translate this? Option one, yes, it is as you say. Just a straight affirmative, yeah, as you say, you said it. Or, again, in the form of a question, do you say so, right? And the commentary that actually argued for the form of a question kind of pointed out that that would be, in Pilate's mind, a pointless question, right? If you're asking Pilate, well, do you say that I am the king of the Jews? Pilate would basically be thinking, why would I, a Roman governor, care if you claim to be king of the Jews? How does that affect me, right? And then, of course, the spiritual reality of that would be, it does affect you. But anyway, not to say that you shouldn't translate that as a question, but it's interesting. Again, no doubt, regardless of how you translate it, it is an affirmative yes, right? But despite the lies and the manipulation of Jesus' teachings by the Sanhedrin, they actually failed to persuade Pilate outright. And there's several reasons why this is that are listed by different commentaries. The biggest one is probably just Pilate would be disinterested in sentencing Jesus to death because he probably understood this as Jewish infighting, right? This group of Jews can't get along with this group of Jews. Why does this affect me? And more specifically, why does this affect Rome? How does me sentencing or not sentencing this man benefit Rome? It doesn't. And Pilate just probably didn't want to do it. Okay. This is my last page, and it's only like a third of a page. Jesus' ambiguous answer. This is your next blank. Jesus' ambiguous answer to Pilate's question is likely the result of the intent behind Pilate's question. In other words, Pilate did not have a good intention in asking the question, or he did not ask the question for the right reasons, whatever, and that is why Jesus gives this sort of non-answer, right? Pilate's question meant, are you a political king? Do you claim to be the political king of the Jews? And due to the way that this is phrased, right, for Jesus to say, no, I am not the king of the Jews would be inaccurate. But for Jesus to answer straightforwardly, yes, I am the king of the Jews, would also be inaccurate because Pilate is clearly talking about political, you want to establish a new political independent kingdom in Israel, which Jesus was not interested in doing. So had Jesus said, no, I'm not the king of the Jews, that would be inaccurate because he is, spiritually, right? But if he said, yes, I am the political king of the Jews, that would also be inaccurate, right? So Jesus just sort of gives this ambiguous answer, and that's why. Very similar to the ambiguous answers he gave to the the Sanhedrin, because they were asking one thing meaning one thing, and Jesus meant another thing. In John's Gospel, when Jesus appears before Pilate, Jesus says, my kingdom is not of this world. If it were, my servants would fight to prevent my arrest by the Jewish leaders. But now my kingdom is from another place. So again, I'm not a political earthly king. It's not a political earthly kingdom. My kingdom is not of this world. It's spiritual. Pilate says here in Luke, I find no basis for a charge against this man. But the people persist, right? We have to do something about this man. We have to crucify him. We have to put him to death. We have to sentence him. And they say to Pilate, he stirs up the people all over Judea by his teaching. Now, this is true. We talked about with the triumphal entry, you had some people that outright hated Jesus and wanted to kill him. You had some people that, Hosanna, blessed is the one who comes in the name of the Lord, right? And they threw down palm branches. And you had a lot of people that were probably just curious as to what's Jesus going to do because they saw the writing on the wall. Something's going to go down this week, right? But he was stirring up the local populations, right? That part's not necessarily a lie. He stirs up the people all over Judea by his teaching. And specifically, what they say is he started in Galilee and has come all the way here, Judea. Verse 5. So when let me see. So after this, Pilate asked if Jesus was a Galilean. Why? Well, because Herod's jurisdiction was Galilee. And next week, we'll actually talk more about Herod. But this is your very last blank, and the very last thing I'll say, and we'll get out of here 5 minutes late. Not too bad. Last blank. If Jesus is from Galilee, and committed his crime at first in Galilee, then it makes sense to refer it back to the Galilean jurisdiction. Not saying that that had nothing to do with it. But a large part of it also probably was, okay, this guy is from Galilee, and back then, right, depending on where you're tried, you know, you get different privileges and whatnot, so I'm sure that that had something to do with it. But, okay, this guy is from Galilee, and all of this mess, which is now stirred up, apparently the whole dang region all started in Galilee. So let's send them back to Galilee, get back to the source, and figure out what's actually going on, right? And that's what we'll pick up next week. So.